Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk.
Every single day, honestly, it feels like we get such interesting, complex stuff from you, our listeners.
It definitely keeps us on our toes.
For sure. And well, we love it. It means we're hitting the topics you really want to get into.
Absolutely. And this stack of material you sent for today, a perfect example. We've got articles, reports, all focusing on South Korea's presidential election.
Right.
And there's this one word that keeps popping up in multiple sources to describe it. Chaotic.
Chaotic. Yeah, that word just jumps out. You don't usually throw that around lightly about, a democratic election.
Exactly. So that's our mission for this deep dive. Right, let's unpack these sources you sent, pull out the key details, the data.
And figure out why. Why is this election being described as chaos?
Precisely. We're going beyond just that headline to look at the different layers, the factors involved here.
Okay, so first things first. Let's set the scene. The election itself. What do the sources say about the timing?
Right. So the main voting day was June 3rd. Polls opened 6 a.m., closed 8 p.m. Korea Standard Time.
Which, for listeners maybe in Central Standard Time, that's afternoon June 2nd, 4 p.m., running through to the morning of June 3rd, 6 a.m. CST.
Got it.
Now, here's something interesting the sources highlight, especially with that chaos label floating around. The early voting turnout. It was high, really high.
Yeah, 34.74%. That's a big number.
How big?
Well, the sources flag it as the second highest early voting turnout they've ever had for presidential election. And overseas voting, also a record high, 79.5% participation.
Wow. Okay, so even with all the stuff we're about to get into, people were showing up. They were engaged.
Seems like a strong signal of participation for sure. People clearly wanted to vote.
That definitely stands out. Okay, so high turnout. What about results? When do the sources expect we'll know something?
Relatively quickly is the sense we get. Probably evening June 3rd in Korea, maybe stretching into dawn June 4th KST.
Which for CST listeners is morning or maybe noon on June 3rd.
Right. And if we look back, at the 2022 election, the winner was called about 9 hours after polls closed. So that's maybe a rough guide.
And just to be clear, as we're doing this deep dive right now, June 3rd KST, voting is still happening over there.
That's correct. It's actually a public holiday in South Korea today, just for the election. So yeah, early votes are counted, but the final picture still coming together.
Okay. But let's get back to that word chaotic. We've got this structured process, high turnout. What specifically are the sources pointing to? What's driving this feeling of chaos?
Well, it seems like it's a mix of things kind of piling up. The first big one, maybe the foundation for it all, is the intense political turmoil just before this election, the whole impeachment aftermath.
Ah, right. That was dramatic. The sources lay out the timeline. Former President Yoon Suk-yeol declaring martial law, December 3rd, 2024.
Yeah, and the stated reasons were about, anti-state forces, the North Korean threat.
But the feeling, based on the sources, was that it was really tied to his own political problems at home, right?
That's the strong perception coming through, yes. Not just external stuff.
And the reaction was fast. That martial law lasted, 6 hours?
Just 6 hours. The National Assembly shut it down almost immediately.
Which then set the stage for the impeachment vote. That was December 14th.
Yep, and it passed decisively. 204 votes out of 300 in the Assembly.
Then it went to the Constitutional Court. They confirmed it April 4th, 2025. Yoon was out.
And then, crucially, he was arrested. The sources make a big point of this. He's the first sitting president in their history to be arrested. That's unprecedented.
Absolutely unprecedented. And the impact of all that, the sources say, was huge. It just cranked up the political polarization, street protests.
Big time. Both sides. Reports mention Yoon's supporters even tried to storm the court back in January to stop the arrest.
That shows you the level of division, the anger.
Exactly. So the key takeaway here is just how fast and deep this political breakdown was. Impeachment, arrest, all within months. It's described as the worst crisis in decades, really shaking people's faith in their democratic institutions.
And that instability had immediate consequences for leadership too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Constant change at the top. South Korea's had 3 different acting presidents in just the last 6 months. Choi Sang-mak, Han Duck-soo, Lee Joo-ho.
3 acting presidents in 6 months. Wow. The source is calling it the most severe crisis in decades. You can see why. That kind of turnover definitely feeds into that chaos narrative.
No doubt. And it wasn't just the high-level politics. The sources also detail specific problems, controversies that hit the election process itself. Things that made voters doubt the fairness.
Okay, so this is about the nuts and bolts of voting.
Yeah, exactly. During early voting, there were reports, kind of alarming ones. about ballots from the last election, the National Assembly one, being found mixed in with the current presidential ballot.
Wait, old ballots mixed in?
Yeah. Obviously, that raises immediate red flags about, the integrity of the count, fairness, even proxy voting concerns. Plus, there was another issue reported, weird sealing paper on ballot boxes in one area, Changwon.
So the body in charge, the National Election Commission, the NEC, they must have caught heat for this.
Oh, big time. Lots of criticism for poor management, according to the sources. They did come out and apologize, promised to do better things like live streaming the ballot count, police escorts for the ballot boxes, trying to boost transparency.
But the damage might have already been done.
Oh, yeah. And then you had these unverified fraud conspiracy theories just taking off, especially on places like X, social media.
What kind of theories?
All sorts. Claims about illegal voting by Chinese citizens, election supervisors wearing U.S.-linked gear being harassed, discrepancies in voter numbers.
Discrepancy.
Yeah, yes. Like numbers not adding up. And one really wild claim the sources mentioned was about receiving 530,000 early votes in just 1 hour, which sounds
impossible.
Pretty much, yeah. 530,000 in an hour. Now, the sources are clear. These are unverified theories.
Right. Important distinction.
But the effect was real. These controversies, whether they were fully proven or just rumors flying around, they made some voters, particularly conservatives, really question if the election was fair. Trust in the NEC took a hit.
And eroded trust in the process itself. That definitely fuels a sense of chaos.
Undeniably. It adds another layer.
Okay, so we've got the background political turmoil, then issues with the voting process itself. What else contributes to this chaotic picture?
Well, the sources point to the deep political polarization in the country. It's not just about Yoon anymore. It's woven into the fabric of society and, apparently, the election campaign.
How so?
Well, one interesting point from the sources is comparing the support for Yoon's impeachment, around 60%, to Park Geun-hye's impeachment years ago, which was closer to 80%.
That's less agreement this time. More division.
Exactly. It suggests the country wasn't as united in its view of the situation. And there's this insight in the sources about the kind of polarization. It's described as less about policy debates.
And more about?
More about just raw emotional opposition, like, I just hate the other side, that kind of feeling.
Oof. That sounds toxic and destabilizing.
Very. It creates this climate where everything feels like a battle, and the main candidates, the sources say, haven't exactly been controversy-free either.
All right, let's talk about them. Lee Jae-myung, the front-runner for the Democrats, around 49% support.
Yeah, but she's facing multiple lawsuits. The sources mention bribery allegations, election law violations, things like that.
And those trials?
Put on hold until after the election. That decision itself drew criticism, as you can imagine. Plus, some critics say his political positions can be a bit vague.
Okay. And the other main candidate, Kim Moon-soo, People Power Party, support around 35-38%.
Right. And he's on record supporting Yu's martial law declaration back in December.
Oh.
Plus, his own party's nomination process was apparently a mess. The sources describe it as chaotic. He was actually replaced for a bit by Han Duck-soo, then put back in as the candidate.
So internal party chaos spilling out into the open.
Yeah. The sources mentioned some public commentary calling it self-destruction by the People Power Party.
And you mentioned X earlier.
Right.
Any other takes from there?
Well, yeah, related to this, some voices on those platforms were framing the whole thing, the impeachment this election, as basically a coup by the opposition in the National Assembly.
Wow. Strong language.
Very. And that kind of rhetoric just adds fuel to the fire, reinforcing that overall impression of chaos and breakdown.
Okay, so recap. Deep political crisis, election process doubts, intense polarization, candidate issues. That's a lot of domestic turmoil. But the sources also bring in external factors, right?
They do. South Korea doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are major external pressures and economic headwinds adding to the instability.
Like what?
Well, geopolitically, you've got North Korea and Russia signing a mutual assistance treaty, both upgrading their militaries. That's a direct security concern right on their doorstep.
And then the U.S. relationship.
Under Trump, yeah. The sources mentioned the 25% tariffs he imposed on South Korean goods, though they note it was temporarily lowered to 10%, and the ongoing demands for Seoul to pay more for U.S. troops stationed there.
Plus China, their biggest trading partner.
Exactly. Managing that relationship is always tricky, especially with global issues like semiconductor export controls in the mix. It's a tough balancing act.
How do the candidates approach this, according to the sources?
Differently. Lee Jae-myung, the Democrat, is described as wanting a strong U.S. alliance, but also pragmatic ties with China and Russia. And more dialogue with North Korea,
and Kim Moon-soo.
More of a hardliner on North Korea, prioritizes the U.S. and Japan relationship. Although the sources note there's some historical friction between Lee's party and Japan.
So complex foreign policy challenges for whoever wins. What about the economy?
Also challenging, based on the source material, slow growth, a widening income gap. They mention the high suicide rate and, sadly, the world's lowest birth rate.
That's a tough mix.
It is. And things like Trump's tariff war hit their export-heavy economy directly. The sources suggest all this economic uncertainty just adds to people's anxiety, feeding that overall feeling of chaos.
Any perspectives from, like, the business world and the sources?
Yeah, actually. They quote Walter Cho, the chairman and CEO of Korean Air. He talks about global tariffs causing confusion, even for aviation, which usually isn't targeted. He basically says getting a predictable trade deal is priority number one for the next president, just so businesses can plan.
Makes sense. Predictability is key.
He also mentioned the volatile currency, the won, and how the whole economic picture affects travel and cargo demand. So yeah, the economic stress is real, felt on the ground.
Okay, wow. That's quite a picture. Political crisis, election doubts, deep divisions, external threats, economic woes. It sounds overwhelming.
It does paint a grim picture in many ways. But the sources also offer some counterpoints, maybe glimmers of hope or at least signs of engagement.
Like the high early voter turnout we mentioned at the start?
Exactly, that 34.74%. The sources see that as a powerful sign. Despite everything feeling chaotic, people are still participating, still showing up.
Suggesting maybe a hope that voting can make a difference, stabilize things.
That seems to be the interpretation, yeah. A hope that a new leader could restore some trust, find a way forward.
What about investors? How are they reacting, according to the sources?
Interestingly, there seems to be some optimism there, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, the worst of the political turmoil from the last few months is ending.
And that's showing up in the markets.
Apparently so. The reports mention inflows into South Korean stock ETFs, $186 million in May, which is significant because it's the first inflow like that in a whole year.
First in a year. Okay, that signals something.
And the main stock index, the Kospi, rallied 4% in the week before the election. The Won also gained a bit against the dollar. So some positive market signals.
Any specific hopes driving that?
Well, the sources mentioned talk about corporate governance reforms. Both candidates have touched on it. Some investors see that as a potential path to finally tackling the Korea discount.
The idea that Korean stocks are undervalued partly due to governance issues?
Exactly. The hope is maybe that could shift towards a Korea premium if reforms happen.
That would be a big shift. But is the optimism maybe getting ahead of reality? What about the underlying economy?
Good question. And the sources do provide that reality check. They mentioned the Bank of Korea just cut interest rates and lowered its growth forecast for the year down to just 0.8% from 1.5%.
Ouch. 0.8%. That's low.
It is. So while there's hope tied to political change and potential reforms driving some market optimism,
the fundamental economic challenges are still very much there.
Concisely. The central bank's actions paint a more cautious picture.
Okay. So putting it all together now, when you look at everything the sources describe, this incredibly rapid political crisis with the impeachment and arrest, the doubts swirling around the voting process itself, the really deep societal divisions, the candidates' own issues, plus all those external pressures and the shaky economy, it becomes much, much clearer why people are using that word chaotic to describe this election.
Absolutely. It's not just one thing. It's this complex interplay of all these factors hitting at once. Understanding those layers is crucial to grasping what's going on beyond just a simple headline.
It really sounds like a nation wrestling with some major internal fault lines while also trying to navigate a really tricky global situation.
That sums it up well. But, and this is important, it's also a nation where, as that high turnout shows, people are still deeply engaged.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.
There's this controversial political comment, but it opens up these complex regional dynamics, right?
Yeah, things happening both, close to home for them and further afield. It's a perfect example, really, of how one small event or comment can show you these much bigger geopolitical currents.
Right.
We're looking at stuff here that touches on, well, moral responsibility, national security, economic pressures, and even direct challenges to their sovereignty. It all kind of converges.
And the spark, as you said, is this comment by a South Korean presidential candidate about Taiwan. But that quickly leads us into looking at South Korea's whole balancing act with China.
Including what's actually happening on the water in their shared seas.
Yeah, the real-world friction.
Exactly. So, by diving into the material you've shared, we can start to unpack the different angles, understand the pressures South Korea is under, and, why it matters. Not just for them, but for the whole region, and maybe even for you listening.
Okay, let's get into it then. So the material kicks things off with this really attention-grabbing quote. It mentions South Korean presidential candidate Lee Jae-myung. He's asked about helping Taiwan if China attacked, and he comes back with, "When aliens invade the Earth, I will think about this problem."
Wow. Yeah.
Wild, right? And this wasn't just some random remark. It was in a Time magazine interview right before a big election, May 2025, where he was actually leading in the polls.
It definitely cut through the noise, didn't it? I mean, that comment just immediately highlights the core debate, the really tough questions South Korea is grappling with. Should they actually commit to helping Taiwan if China makes a move?
And the material lays out strong arguments on both sides.
It really does.
So let's start with the arguments for South Korea stepping in. Why should they help Taiwan, according to this perspective?
Well, one big argument is about moral responsibility and, their international standing. The idea is, as a democracy, South Korea kind of has a duty to support other democracies, especially when they're facing authoritarian pressure.
Like standing up for shared values.
Precisely. Turning a blind eye, it could really damage their image on the world stage. Then there's the whole regional security angle.
Right.
Taiwan's security is just deeply connected to stability across East Asia. An attack there wouldn't just stay there, It could easily spark a wider crisis that directly impacts South Korea's own security. They're kind of mutually dependent in a pretty tense neighborhood.
And history comes into play too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The material reminds us South Korea itself got critical international help during the Korean War.
From the U.S. and the UN, yeah.
Exactly. 16 UN member states led by the U.S.
Yeah.
So there's this argument about reciprocity. If they needed help then and might need it again, shouldn't they offer it now?
Makes sense.
And the material points out, imagine if South Korea faced a crisis and its allies just gave an aliens-type comment back. They'd feel completely alone.
Yeah, that really brings it home.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the case for helping. But there's another side presented, arguing for neutrality or, staying out of it, more focused on South Korea's immediate reality.
Right. And this view prioritizes pragmatism, basically national interest first. A huge factor here is the economy. South Korea's economic relationship with China is just massive.
How big are we talking?
Around $300 billion in bilateral trade in 2024. So any move to aid Taiwan could, realistically, trigger severe economic retaliation from Beijing. That could be devastating for South Korea's economy, which relies heavily on exports.
So the argument is, don't risk that kind of economic pain for something that's not, a direct attack on South Korea itself.
That's the core of it. And then there's the military capacity issue. South Korea's military, its resources are already pretty stretched. Their main focus has to be the immediate threat from North Korea.
Which is nuclear armed.
Exactly. A very real existential threat. Getting involved in Taiwan could divert crucial resources, potentially leaving South Korea more vulnerable right there on the peninsula.
They already have their hands full.
They really do. And finally, there's the foreign policy consistency argument. The material suggests South Korea has generally tried to maintain a fairly neutral stance on these cross-strait issues historically. So actively aiding Taiwan would be a big shift and could complicate relations with other countries too.
Okay, let's go back to Lee Jae-myung's aliens comment itself.
Hmm.
Does the analysis see this as him being clearly pro-China?
Well, it suggests probably more complex than that. The lean seems to be towards a kind of pragmatic opportunism.
Okay.
It mentions some past comments like calling the Taiwan issue a Chinese civil war, and times he avoided criticizing Beijing while meeting their ambassador. Those things point towards a friendlier attitude, plus his constant emphasis on stable economic ties.
But the aliens comment, it feels less like open friendliness and more like he's dodging the question. Evasive.
Exactly. That's a good word for it. The material suggests this ambiguity, plus a more recent trend of him maybe toning down the overtly pro-China talk could be an election strategy.
Balancing act.
Right. Trying to keep China happy for economic reasons, but also not alienating voters at home who might be wary of China. It basically avoids making a clear and potentially costly commitment either way.
But let's say, hypothetically, his underlying goal was primarily to avoid provoking China. How would the aliens' comment fit into that strategy?
Well, the material offers a few ways to look at it from that perspective. One is just simple risk avoidance. China is incredibly sensitive about Taiwan, and the threat of economic backlash is real.
Don't poke the bear.
Pretty much. Another view is it signals South Korea's priority is its own security, the North Korean threat, not getting tangled in what Beijing sees as an internal matter.
Right.
It could also just be about keeping options open during the campaign, or maybe it reflects a genuine belief that intervention is just too risky, or maybe even pointless.
So strategic ambiguity, maybe, from a certain viewpoint.
Yes, but the material is quick to point out the criticisms, too. This kind of approach can look like weak leadership on major global issues. It could damage South Korea's credibility.
And potentially leave them isolated later on.
And that's the crucial risk, isn't it? It comes back to that idea of reciprocity. If you adopt this kind of non-committal stance when others need help, why should you expect help if or when you face your own crisis, whether that comes from North Korea or even China itself down the line?
Okay, so that's the whole difficult debate around Taiwan, which is mostly hypothetical for now. But South Korea is also dealing with very real, very current pressure from China much closer to home.
Right, in their own surrounding waters.
Exactly. Particularly the Yellow Sea, which South Koreans call the West Sea. And this isn't abstract diplomacy. This is about physical presence, about direct challenges to their sovereignty.
Okay, so where exactly are these problems happening in the sea?
A lot of it revolves around the exclusive economic zones, the EEZs, the 200 nautical mile zones where countries have special rights to marine resources.
The issue is South Korea's and China's EEZ claims overlap quite a bit in the Yellow Sea. They do have a fishery agreement from 2001 with a jointly managed area, but they fundamentally disagree on where the actual border should be.
How so?
South Korea generally favors the median line principle, basically drawing the line halfway between the coasts. China, though, argues for a boundary based on factors like its much longer coastline and bigger population, which would push the line much closer to South Korea.
And China seems to be, pushing its claim with actions, not just words.
That's exactly what the material details. Several kinds of incidents. One really striking example is China installing these large, permanent-looking steel structures.
Structures like what?
Over 50 meters tall, reported in early 2025, similar to ones seen back in 2024. And they're putting them in the disputed area, but within South Korea's claimed EEZ.
What does China say they're for?
They call them fishery support structures. But South Korea is understandably suspicious. They worry these are long-term deployments, maybe for surveillance or just asserting control, very similar tactics to what China's used in the South China Sea.
And South Korea protested.
They did, and it got tense. There was apparently a 2-hour standoff between the Coast Guards back in February 2025 when South Korea tried to investigate one of these structures. Reports even said Chinese civilians on the structure were armed.
Yeah, that's definitely a direct challenge. What else is happening out there?
Well, there's a big increase in Chinese military and law enforcement activity. The material notes a huge jump in Chinese Navy warships entering South Korea's EEZ.
How big a jump?
Over 330 times in 2024. Compare that to 110 times back in 2017. China's Coast Guard is also patrolling much more aggressively, often along a line China just unilaterally declared deep inside what South Korea considers its EEZ.
So naval ships, Coast Guard.
Yeah, and there was even an incident in 2024 where a Chinese warship came within just 40 kilometers of a South Korean island, Bingyang Island. That's pretty close.
And the material also mentioned China restricting access sometimes.
Yes. In May 2025, China declared 3 no-sail zones in the Yellow Sea. Now, 2 were for military drills, that happens, but the third one, it was right inside South Korea's EEZ, and they gave no official reason for it. It just restricted navigation for several days.
And Seoul protested that too.
They did. South Korea's foreign ministry called it an excessive restriction of navigation freedom.
And on top of all that, the old problem of illegal fishing is still going on.
Oh, yeah, it's still a major headache. Chinese fishing boats, they have the world's largest fleet, constantly enter South Korea's EEZ illegally, especially during peak seasons.
Like poaching, basically.
Essentially. The material gives an example from October 2024, South Korean Coast Guard seizing boats, expelling others, confiscating tons of fish. It's not just about the fish stocks, though that's serious. It hurts South Korean fishermen economically, and it's a constant challenge to South Korea's ability to actually control its own waters.
So taking all this together, the structures, the warships, the Coast Guard patrols, the no-sail zones, the illegal fishing, it paints a picture of, well, steadily increasing pressure from China in the Yellow Sea. What are the bigger implications here?
The really big question the material raises is whether China is essentially applying a gray zone strategy in the Yellow Sea.
Gray zone, like in the South China Sea.
Exactly like that. Using actions that are short of open military conflict Coast Guard vessels, maritime militia disguised as fishing boats, these structures to gradually change the facts on the ground or water and assert control without firing a shot.
The slow squeeze. Boiling the frog slowly.
That's a good way to put it. And it forces South Korea into difficult choices. How do you respond effectively? Do you ramp up enforcement, try more diplomacy, maybe even international arbitration like the Philippines did?
But protesting too loudly might anger China further.
That's the risk. But then what happens if you don't protest or don't respond forcefully enough? Does that just normalize China's presence and effectively concede ground over time?
And what does this mean for South Korea's actual security and sovereignty?
Well, it's a direct challenge to their control over their EEZ, the resources there. And there are lingering concerns, for example, about China's past claims over Yeouido, that's an underwater reef where South Korea has a research station.
Right.
If China ever decided to escalate, maybe by trying to remove South Korean structures there, build their own, well, that would raise tensions dramatically.
And how does this maritime stuff connect back to the bigger picture, the U.S. alliance, the Taiwan question we started with?
The material suggests a possible link. Could China's assertiveness in the Yellow Sea be partly a reaction to South Korea strengthening its alliance with the U.S.?
Interesting.
There's also the worrying thought, if conflict ever did break out over Taiwan, could the Yellow Sea become a sort of secondary front? And it's also noted that China sometimes seems to ramp up this pressure when South Korea is dealing with internal political issues, maybe seeing an opportunity.
So South Korea is juggling these huge, complex questions about regional security miles away, while at the same time facing these very concrete daily challenges to its sovereignty right in its own backyard.
Okay, let's try and tie these two strands together now. How might someone like Lee Jae-myung, with that pragmatic, maybe China-friendly leaning stance on Taiwan we discussed, how might that connect to how South Korea deals with these direct challenges from China in its own seas?
Yeah, the material seems to hint at a potential connection, doesn't it? If a leader's main focus is on protecting those vital economic ties with China, on avoiding provocation over a huge issue like Taiwan, does that same caution, that same mindset, carry over to how they handle things like illegal fishing or those structures or the naval patrols in their own waters?
Does it lead to a softer response?
Yeah, maybe a response that's less forceful than you might otherwise expect if the priority was purely defending sovereignty above all else.
That's exactly the core tension that emerges when you look at these two issues side by side. South Korea is constantly performing this balancing act. On one hand, the absolute need to maintain that huge economic relationship with China. On the other, the fundamental duty to defend national sovereignty, resources, maritime claims.
Two powerful competing pressures.
Absolutely. And the material shows both sides of how to manage it. You need a strong response, enforcement, maybe international cooperation to deter China and protect what's yours. But you also need diplomacy, a way to avoid escalation that could wreck that vital trade relationship.
It really does feel like they're walking a very fine line, almost a tightrope. And the sources, the material you shared, it ends with a really powerful question that kind of pulls all of this together, doesn't it?
It does. It sort of leaves you, the listener, with this thought. Do we have the ability and courage before becoming victims to stand up for justice?
Wow. Yeah, that really reframes the whole thing, doesn't it? It lifts it beyond just South Korea's specific policies. It becomes a much broader question about, well, collective security, about national resolve, about responsibility in a world where you have these competing interests and rising powers.
Right.
It makes you think hard about where that line is between necessary pragmatism, looking after your own interests, and maybe sacrificing something more fundamental in the long run, security, alliances, maybe even moral standing.
And whether trying to achieve stability at any cost might actually, paradoxically, undermine the trust of the very allies you might really need if someday a crisis does land on your own doorstep.
Well, this deep dive into the material you sent us, it really highlights the incredibly complex pressures countries like South Korea are under in today's world. It's just a fascinating reminder that even what looks like a simple political soundbite can crack open this whole range of really critical interconnected issues.
It really does. And I think digging into the arguments, understanding the specifics, like what's actually happening day to day in the Yellow Sea, it gives you a much clearer, more nuanced picture than just the headlines ever could.
Yeah.
It's all about seeing how these global events connect and the really tough choices nations are forced to make.
We really hope this look at the material has given you some valuable insights, maybe sparked some new questions for you to think about on your own, because that's really what these deep dives are all about.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing these sources with us and for letting us take this journey with you.
Until the next deep dive.